Somewhere out there are Civil War diaries sitting in a university archive that most people will never read. Not because they're classified, not because they're damaged, because no one decided they were important enough to talk about. And the ones that did make it into the history books, the famous letters, the famous generals, the famous battles, those represent a fraction of what this war actually was. The version you were taught was written by a very specific kind of person, under very specific conditions, and almost everything that didn't fit the mold quietly disappeared. 2 out of every 3 people who died in the Civil War were not killed by a bullet. They were killed by their own camp, and almost everything you think you know about that war came from a tiny, accidental slice of people who happened to write it down. Historians estimate somewhere between 620,000 and 750,000 total deaths across both Union and Confederate sides. A number so large it barely registers. But here's the part that changes the whole picture. About 2/3 of those deaths were caused by disease. Only 19% of Union soldiers actually died on the battlefield. The rest died in tents, sick, bored, and waiting. This video is about what the Civil War diaries actually say. Not the textbook version with the cannon charges and the famous generals. The real version. The one that's stranger, messier, and more human than anything you were taught. I've been going deep into the primary sources on this, and there are details here that completely change how the war feels. We're going to cover the numbers that don't make sense until you sit with them, the stories almost nobody tells, and one diary in particular near the end that reframes who this war actually belonged to. Let's start with what the war physically was, before we get into who was living through it. Out of 6.5 million reported cases of sickness and injury among 3.2 million Civil War combatants, only about 500,000 reports represent the battle wounds or accidental injuries. Think about that ratio for a second. 6 million cases of illness, 500,000 actual wounds. The war we picture, the charges, the smoke, the rifles, that was a fraction of it. Most of the war was just men getting sick in crowded camps and waiting to get sicker. Army camps often lacked groundwater drainage and trash removal, and overcrowded tents were too close together. Most camps had open-air latrines just a few feet from sleeping, cooking, and eating areas. Weary soldiers often defecated close to camp, contaminating their water supplies. Hands went unwashed, and food went undercooked. And nobody really understood why any of that mattered yet, because germ theory was barely a concept. Doctors were managing symptoms with sedatives and purgatives. Basically, they were guessing. So disease tore through these camps like nothing else could. Diseases like measles, typhoid fever, and pneumonia contracted in camps killed 224,480 Northern soldiers and 164,000 Southern soldiers, more than all the bullets combined. And there's one disease in particular that basically owned the pages of every soldier's diary. And I'll get to that in a minute, because the numbers are genuinely hard to believe. But first, there's a story almost nobody knows, and it's the one that hits the hardest, because it has almost nothing to do with soldiers at all. His name was Leroy Gresham. He was born in 1847 to an affluent slaveholding family in Macomb, Georgia. After a horrific leg injury left him invalid, the educated, inquisitive, and exceptionally witty 12-year-old began keeping a diary in 1860, just as secession and the Civil War began tearing the country apart. He continued to write even as his health deteriorated, until both the war and his life ended in 1865. He was 17 years old. His journals are the only known diary of a civilian teenage boy spanning the entire period. There's nothing else like it, and what makes it so strange is that it's barely a war diary. It's the journal of a kid watching the world collapse from his bedroom, his only body failing at the same rate as the Confederacy outside his window. Leroy was fatally ill with spinal tuberculosis, a fact hidden from him until the day before he died. He spent 5 years writing about what he read, what he heard, what he had argued about with his parents, all while not fully knowing he was dying. Alternating between bouts of euphoria and despondency, he often wrote, "Saw off my leg," a dark, running joke he kept returning to when the pain got bad enough. That line alone tells you more about what his diary is than any description could. A broader portrait that emerges of a wealthy, slave-holding Southern family was a revelation in ways both large and small. From their surprising ability to weather increasingly severe wartime shortages and inflation without undue hardship, to the daily danger posed by coals exploding out of a fireplace and setting a rug, shawl, or sofa on fire. His family owned around 100 enslaved people. Leroy wrote about the Gresham slaves by name and detailed much about their lives and changing relationships with the family as the war progressed. The war arrives in his pages slowly, through gossip and newspaper headlines, through the sound of distant things, never directly, always filtered through the walls of a house where a teenager is running out of time. The diary affords modern readers the best record of the daily suffering and treatment of terminally ill person during the Civil War era. Beyond the rich evidence relating to his illness and Victorian medicine, it includes a bountiful array of observations about military, political, and social elements of the Civil War as witnessed from the Confederate home front. Now here's the thing about Leroy's diary that matters beyond just his story. He could write it because his family had money, education, and a bedridden kid with nothing but time. That's the filter the entire historical record runs through, and it's worth understanding just how narrow that filter really is. Most of what we know about the Civil War comes from people who were literate, often educated, and had both the means and the physical ability to write things down. Soldiers who kept diaries were not representative of the average man in uniform, and the average man in uniform was not representative of everyone the war was happening to. Millions of ordinary soldiers, enslaved people, and civilians left almost nothing behind, not because their stories weren't worth telling, but because the conditions of their lives made writing them down nearly impossible. And there's one group in particular where this becomes especially striking. While there were nurses, camp followers, and some women who disguised themselves as men, camp life was overwhelmingly male, at least on the surface. Historians estimate as many as 1,000 women served in both Union and Confederate armies, disguised as men. And the reason we know about most of them is almost poetic in how it connects back to everything else in this video. Most of them were discovered not through combat injuries, but because they got sick. They fell ill from dysentery or chronic diarrhea in camp, and that's when their cover was blown. Disease didn't just kill soldiers, it exposed the ones who weren't supposed to be there at all. Which brings us to the disease numbers, and this is the part that fills most of the actual diary pages. Not heroics, not battles, stomach pain, and latrines. Union medical records alone logged over 1.7 million cases of diarrhea and dysentery in a force that never exceeded around 1 million men. That means the average Union soldier went through it more than once. There were 75,148 documented cases of typhoid fever with 27,058 deaths, a 36% mortality rate within the Union Army alone. Conditions in camp were perfect for the spread of diseases like typhoid. The lack of sanitation, improper placement of latrines, and general lack of knowledge of germ theory allowed sickness to thrive. These factors, combined with the rampant disregard for surgeons' pleas for proper sanitation by both enlisted soldiers and their officers, aided in the spread. This is what the diaries are actually full of. Not glory, pages. Pages and pages of men describing their symptoms, their treatments, their boredom, and their fear, not of the enemy, but of their own bodies. And then, in between those entries, you get something genuinely strange. Something nobody puts in the documentaries. Sometimes, items were even exchanged between camps from each side. Neither side could consistently provide supplies for their soldiers, so it wasn't uncommon, though officially forbidden, for common soldiers to trade with the enemy. Confederate soldiers prized Northern newspapers and coffee. Northerners were glad to barter these for Southern tobacco. In one tale of folklore, Confederate soldiers sent small crafted sailboats to Union soldiers across the Rappahannock River in Fredericksburg, requesting coffee be returned as soon as the wind changed in exchange for tobacco. Men who were supposed to be trying to kill each other, floating tiny handmade boats across a river with little tobacco parcels on them, waiting for the wind to shift so coffee could come back the other way. And one Union soldier at Petersburg in 1864 captured the psychological strangeness of it all better than any historian ever could. He wrote, "These men who take one another by the hand this minute, may the next send one another to the spirit land. These who are now trading tobacco for coffee and sugar, may, ere another hour rolls around, be trading lead for lead." That one line does more to explain what this war actually felt like than almost anything else written about it. And it only survived because someone wrote it in a diary that happened to make it to us. That's the thread running through all this. The dying teenager in Macon, the woman in camp discovered through illness, the soldier watching men trade goods across the front lines. Every single one of these stories exists only because someone happened to write it down, in the right conditions, at the right time, and the paper survived. The Civil War we've inherited is not the whole war. It's the documented war, and those are two very different things. So, here's to where we land. The war you learned about, the one with the famous battles and the famous generals, that version is real. But it's a highlight reel of a much longer, much quieter, much sicker experience. For every man who fell to a bullet or a blade, disease erased two more, making the camp latrine a deadlier address than any contested ridge or river crossing. Most soldiers spent far more sick days in a tent than they ever spent in combat. And the people who wrote it all down were a narrow, accidental slice of everyone the war was actually happening to. Leroy Gresham spent 5 years watching a war he couldn't fight and a body that was failing him, writing almost every day until he couldn't anymore. He continued writing almost every day for 5 years. He stopped just a few weeks before he passed away in 1865. The Confederacy he'd grown up in collapsed the same year he did. His diary is the closest thing we have to the voice of a civilian teenager living through all of it. And most people have never heard his name. That's what the diary no one talks about actually are. They're not hidden because they're boring. They're hidden because they don't fit the version of the story we already decided to tell. Hey, make sure to drop a comment. Which detail from this video hit you the hardest? The disease numbers? Leroy's diary? How about the tobacco hats on the Rappahannock? I'm really curious which one landed differently for you. And if you want to go deeper on this kind of history, the kind that gets left out of the textbooks, there's another video right here that follows the same thread. It's worth your time. Subscribe if you're new, and there's a lot more of this coming.